Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Its 5-year mission to explore Star Trek arcs and themes, seek out new story directions, and boldly tell stories that no one has told before.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
Growing up, it should be no surprise that Star Trek was my favorite TV show. But at the time, the other show that had a massive impact on me was The Twilight Zone. It's hard to ignore the groundbreaking power of The Twilight Zone, and there's no doubt that it changed television forever. Despite being dated and black and white, still the first run of the series from 1959 to 1964 is still more popular than any of the reboots. While the 80s version of the show came close, the last two attempts have been met with the energy of a direct-to-syndication Baywatch spinoff. Why have the Twilight Zone reboots failed to ignite the audiences, and what could Star Trek showrunners learn from their mistakes? That's my topic today. It is clear in many ways that we would never have gotten Star Trek as we know it without Rod Serling and his writers setting the social-political tone, as well as creating great reels for most of the actors that would later lead the Star Trek franchise. The Twilight Zone is very unique for early television in the sense that it was not built on the actors or the star power on the screen. The power of the Twilight Zone was 100% pure story. The strength of the first incarnation was Serling's writers, many of whom Roddenberry would also employ during the first 3 seasons of Star Trek. The 80s series lasted almost as long as the original and had the respect for genre writers in a way the last 2 reboots failed to do. Let's go deeper on that. It was watching Star Trek and the Twilight Zone that first taught me what a writer was. It was seeing Richard Matheson's name on the Enemy Within episode and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, and then seeing his name on the spine of books at the bookstore that taught me, oh yeah, a person does this for their job. I bought short story collections called Shock and Shock 1, 2, and 3 from Matheson, and was surprised to see that Third from the Sun and Mute, stories I knew from the Twilight Zone, were in these books, and the copyright was far older than the Twilight Zone show. It was clear that Serling understood that the star of the Twilight Zone was the story and the storytellers. The short anthology storylines meant that as a whole, the series works like an anthology. It's not like this hasn't been done before, but what separated Twilight Zone was creator Rod Serling. He was considered the Hemingway of TV drama, but had suffered censorship for trying to express himself politically in TV despite having won Emmy Awards for Patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight, and The Comedian. He was told that the sponsors would not support him telling topical stories. He figured science fiction, fantasy, and horror were the way to sugarcoat the message, and that was also an influence on Roddenberry. Consider this quote from Serling. Quote, "I was not permitted to have my senators discuss any current or pressing problem. To say a single thing that was germane to the current political scene was absolutely prohibited. In retrospect, I probably should have made it science fiction. Put it in the year 2057 and people the Senate with robots, and this would have been more reasonable and no less dramatically incisive." Mike Wallace even asked him at the time, "Have you given up serious television?" The network was buying into Serling, and according to his contract, he was supposed to write a staggering 80% of the scripts himself. When the show started, Serling got over 14,000 submissions, but the scripts were from the mostly very talented but well-trained episodic TV writers or writers without any skill. Basically, they didn't get what Serling wanted, so he invited a group of local writers to a meeting. He wanted stories like those of Ray Bradbury, whose classic story I Sing Body Electric was his one and only Twilight Zone credit. Bradbury lived in LA and Serling called him up. He and Serling would eventually grow to dislike each other, but it was Bradbury that told Serling about a writers group, a bunch of friends who called themselves The Group. Today they are remembered as the California Sorcerers. One generation removed from another LA sci-fi writers group, the Manana Literary Society, founded by Robert Heinlein, featuring L. Ron Hubbard, C. L. Moore, and it was fictionalized in Tony Boucher's classic murder mystery novel, Rocket to the Morgue. Consider how Serling felt about writers, and excuse the sexism here, but the quote's important. All writers are born. They are never made. On the other hand, we can sharpen the wit of the writer. We can point out style to him. We can use that criteria that is age-old, 3,000 years of theater, that he can utilize to make a judgment on the value of his own work. We can show him what can move people. He rejected the formula that TV writers were taught to follow and hired a group of outsiders. While Ray Bradbury had published his first novel as far back as 1947, the members of the group were largely unknown at the time. I Am Legend, which is now considered a classic and a masterpiece of two genres, was still being workshopped by Matheson in a UCLA class, and he was spitballing ideas with the group. Writers who became the core of the Twilight Zone were hanging out in the group. Charles Beaumont, George Clayton Johnson, and William F. Nolan were among them. They were operating like a writer's room, but producing classic novels like The Intruder, Fahrenheit 451, Logan's Run, The Shrinking Man, I Am Legend, and more during this period. They would go on to write scripts that would be directed by Dan Curtis, Roger Corman, and Steven Spielberg, to name a few. Serling was never a member of the group, but he respected their work, and he did sometimes workshop stories outside of the Twilight Zone context. The reasons the stories worked is partly their short and powerful format. I think the 1-hour format does not help, but it is not the reason why the modern Twilight Zone has been so far disappointing. While many big-name actors were on the Twilight Zone, most of them had not become famous. It was the stories that were the stars. Many of the episodes by the group were short stories first, appearing in science fiction and fantasy magazines. They were not devised to be on TV. They were not written by writers with a ton of TV training, although the members of the group would go on to write extensively in Thriller, One Step Beyond, The Outer Limits, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and yes, Star Trek. I have no idea if Serling and Roddenberry talked, but I imagine they probably went to car races with the group or drank together at some point. Star Trek made a point to be adult science fiction, buying story treatments from serious science fiction writers and even a few scripts. Consider for a moment some of the names that and the classic works they wrote who developed and at the very least sold story treatments to Star Trek. A. von Vogt, whose Null A books were a huge influence in the 40s, Philip Jose Farmer, whose Riverworld books became classics, Larry Niven, who wrote the Ringworld books, and sci-fi absurdist Robert Sheckley all wrote multiple unproduced story treatments that were bought by Roddenberry. The fact that the producers were even talking to these important science fiction figures is important enough to consider, but some got on the air. Richard Matheson of the group wrote The Enemy Within, a classic episode. Robert Bloch, friend of the group and novelist behind Psycho, wrote 3 episodes. Theodore Sturgeon, the award-winning novelist behind several classics like More Than Human, introduced the Vulcans' mating rituals and the planet itself. Norman Spinrad, the cranky, anarchist, radical sci-fi writer, created the Doomsday Machine, and of course Harlan Ellison wrote the first draft of the episode that became the most popular episode of the show. When Isaac Asimov attacked the show and TV Guide as being juvenile, consider how Roddenberry responded. Quote, Star Trek almost did not get on the air because it refused to do juvenile science fiction, because it refused to put a lassie on board the spaceship, and because it insisted on hiring Dick Matheson, Harlan Ellison, A.E. von Vogt, Phil Farmer, and so on. I believe the decision that Roddenberry is talking about is key to why Star Trek, not Lost in Space, survived the majority of the last half century on the air and publishing constantly. That is why Star Trek is as popular as it is. While none of the Twilight Zone reboots ever matched the quality of the 60s show, the 80s series followed the writer-first mentality and hired Harlan Ellison as story editor and showrunner. They adapted published short stories by Greg Bear, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert McCammon, and Stephen King. A highlight is the William Friedkin-directed adaptation of the Robert McCammon short story Nightcrawlers. The writing staff did hire freelancers, and they gave the first TV job to a barely known at the time writer George R.R. Martin, although he had already won the Hugo for Night Flyers. So that shows respect for the writer. Far from perfect, the Twilight Zone writers at this point lacked a diversity of race and gender, but they clearly understood the genre. The 2002 reboot was a failure despite the presence of very good TV writers, including several Deep Space Nine vets I respect immensely, like Ira Stephen Bear, Robert Hewitt Wolfe, David Weddle, and Bradley Thompson. All good writers. But all the episodes were original and were trying to be Twilight Zone instead of already published stories that existed with the Twilight Zone vibe. The latest reboot worked a little better for me, and the involvement of Jordan Peele seemed a smart move, but after the announcement I took to Twitter and warned that the new Twilight Zone seemed to be making the same mistake. It needed writers similar to the group. Stories by writers like, David Scow, who just contributed the best episode of the new Creep Show. Joe R. Lansdale, Cody Goodfellow, Lisa Morton, and Brian Evanson were fantastic, weird short story writers that came to my mind right away. But there are many more diverse voices, like excellent writers of color, for example, Maurice Broaddus, Gabino Iglesias, Sylvia Moreno Garcia, Nadia Okafor, or LGBTQ voices like Sam J. Miller that come to my mind. There is one episode that has a writing credit for Chinara Vdu and her partner Stephen Barnes. That's a good start, but it's only one episode. The whole show should draw on weird literature that is at the heart of what makes the Twilight Zone great. Take a look at the credits of the writers who wrote the episodes of the modern show. They're mostly TV writers, TV comedy writers. And despite Glenn Morgan and his X-Files experience, the stories were all created by the writers, and the episodes do not have the literary origins besides the awful Nightmare at 20,000 Feet update. When all is said and done, I didn't hate the show. In fact, I think the episode Replay was a very good Twilight Zone episode. But the show could have been so much better. I think the same writing staff could have worked for the Twilight Zone, but the show would have been stronger with one producer who knows the literary canon of weird fiction, or if published genre writers or an editor like Ellen Datlow, for example, could have consulted on the show. And that brings me to modern Star Trek. I understand that the majority of new Star Trek, like Discovery and Picard, will be serialized storytelling and require a writer's room telling one consistent story. But if Strange New Worlds is going to take an old-school episodic approach, why not hire some real science fiction writers to pitch some storylines? If not for the air, maybe for tie-in novels. Your Gregory Benfords, your Nnedi Okorafor, John Scalzi, Sam J. Miller, N.K. Jemisin. The list is endless of potential writers. Science fiction authors can sometimes come up with incredible ideas, as an example that worked for making good science fiction. I was thinking of the producers of Stargate Universe hiring John Scalzi as a consultant. While the show was not entirely successful, the science fiction elements were way above average from the two previous shows in the franchise. Check out the Solar Scoop episode. Seriously, it's great science fiction. I do respect that Kurtzman hired Kirsten Beyer, whose 10 Voyager novels and knowledge of Star Trek canon has been key to the success of the new shows. It's not just her knowledge of the canon, it's her experiences with long-form Star Trek storytelling that has really paid off. During Deep Space Nine and Voyager, the writers of Star Trek novels were given a chance to pitch and write episodes. Even my favorite science fiction writer, John Shirley, got to write an episode of Deep Space Nine. Perhaps one of the best examples was Starship Down, co-written by pocketbook Star Trek editor John Ordever and Star Trek novelist David Mack. Let me say again, I am happy with the current writers in the writing room, but I think the lesson that Rod Serling taught Roddenberry could only help the further development of Star Trek in the future. In the early days, Star Trek writers were connected enough with the pulps and sci-fi magazines. When the episode Arena was written by Gene Kuhn, who thought it was original, a member of the production staff remembered that it was similar to a classic pulp story by Frederick Brown that appeared in the June 1944 issue of Astounding Science Fiction magazine. Respect for the maturity of stories and the genre was clearly something that Roddenberry found important. It wouldn't hurt for CBS All Access shows to get to the heart of what made these shows different right off the bat. Thank you for listening to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. I'm David Agranoff. I am the author, critic, and podcaster who writes science fiction and horror novels. I have 7 novels and 2 short story collections out. I was nominated for the Wonderland and Splatterpunk Awards. My latest book is a science fiction novel called Goddamn Killing Machines. If you want to support this podcast, I just do it for fun. I don't expect donations or have a Patreon. So if you want to support me, buy one of my books. Goddamn Killing Machines is available from the Clash Books website, and all my books are on Amazon. You can search by my name. You can also follow me at David Agranoff Author or at Star Trek Arcs. And have fun. Let's boldly go. Thanks for listening.